So right now we're in the sort of center of downtown Newark. We're near the Four Corners, historical spot, always lots of activity, lots of culture. As you keep moving downtown, you start seeing these changes, you start seeing, yesterday mixing in with today, for example, Military Park. If you look at this space from an aerial view, the hilt is the monument, and then the rest of this weapon is this gigantic sword. 1,000 years in the future, that stone's still gonna be there. That metal is still gonna be there. It's still gonna be telling that story, and there's only one site. So if I look at this monument today, and I think of myself, and I think of people like myself, I can understand and see the connection between wars America has fought and how that creates migration, immigration. A blockade on Cuba that creates people leaving Cuba and coming and settling in West New York, New Jersey, where I grew up. And then those immigrants creating bakeries where I ate at. That's my introduction to the country. That's where I come in, understanding the history and the wars and the migrations that come from that. It's a beautiful park. It's about war. This idea of patriotism, the idea of nation making, where we look at history through romantic eyes and we sort of just pull out the beautiful part of it, and we pull out the narrative of the winner. And I think in order for us to look at history and at ourselves more clearly, we have to look at the whole picture. To think about the Revolutionary War, to think about freedom, rebellion, there's still a beautiful sort of radicalness to it, right? There's the romanticized idea of people grabbing muskets and fighting for their freedom, which is wonderful, and part of it is true. But part of it is just a Hollywood movie now. I'm not trying to deny history, I'm trying to open up the possibilities to see history that has not been talked about, and I think that is revolutionary in a way. We can recontextualize history and open it up to questioning, and depending on the site, maybe it is better to throw them in the river. But for others, maybe it's better for us to look at them and understand why that was there, why it was allowed to stay there for so long, and what we can learn from that.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2022 New Jersey History Conference, Freedom Seeker, Colonizer, and Enslaved, Immigration and Migration in New Jersey. I'm Sara Cureton, and it is my honor to serve as the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission. Now, I think we all know that today New Jersey is a very diverse place, with people and communities that reflect the cultures of nations around the globe. This rich diversity truly accounts for why New Jersey is such a dynamic place to live and work. But fewer people realize that what we now know as New Jersey is part of Lenapehoking, the ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape. And even fewer know that this land was home to many diverse peoples for hundreds of years. Today in our conference sessions, we will learn about some of those who came to these shores for many reasons, some of which are reflected in our conference title. In the space of the few hours that we have together, we can only begin to scratch the surface of this theme, but that only means that there will be much more to discover and share in new research for future conferences. But before we get started, let me thank our conference planning committee who worked so hard to develop today's program. I must also thank Beth Lawrence, our meeting planner, for all the technical assistance she provided. But first and foremost, I must thank Noelle Lorraine Williams, Director of the Commission's African American History Program, who led the planning for this event. Because of her able leadership, we have a wonderful program to enjoy today. And now I'm delighted to introduce New Jersey's Secretary of State, Tahesha Way. Tahesha Way serves as New Jersey's 34th Secretary of State. Nominated for appointment by Governor Phil Murphy on December 18, 2017, Ms. Way was sworn in on February 26, 2018. As Secretary of State, Ms. Way holds one of the nation's oldest constitutional offices and leads a department with a diverse portfolio. She serves as New Jersey's top election official, overseeing the State Division of Elections and its work in securing our democracy and ensuring broad, fair access to the right to vote. In addition to this critical work, Secretary Way also oversees the state government offices supporting New Jersey's vibrant arts, culture, history, and business communities. And we are especially proud to say that this year she serves as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. So once again, let me welcome Secretary of State Tahesha Way.
Thanks so much, Sara. And it was such a powerful opening video presentation, I must say. Good morning. Happy Friday and welcome to the New Jersey Historical Commission's 2022 annual conference. This year's theme, Freedom Seeker, Colonizer and Enslaved, Immigration and Migration in New Jersey, is an opportunity to explore our state's history and culture through the lenses of the immigrant communities that have called New Jersey home. This yearly program not only brings together scholars and students who care about public history, but also community leaders who champion our historical sites for the benefit of the public. I'm proud that this conference represents the latest in New Jersey's ongoing efforts to highlight the rich cultural stories that define our vibrant communities. Yes, our state's history is filled with stories of people from New Jersey and all over the world who settled here by choice, chance, or sometimes by force. Their experiences are intrinsic to understanding New Jersey's past, present, and future. We see this every day in our communities via language, custom, faith, and even food. And I am so grateful for the ways we in state government can amplify and include the experiences of immigrants in our work. In fact, earlier this year, New Jersey became just the second state in the United States to include Asian American studies as a standard part of the state's history curriculum. And just this September, Governor Murphy signed legislation formally establishing New Jersey's Black Heritage Trail. I'm excited that my historical commission, which includes our African American historian, Noel Williams, will lead the effort to designate locations of importance where Black history was made in our state. I know that some of the history highlighted in today's panels will likely shape the trail and the locations. I also know that we are eager to explore other under-researched areas of New Jersey's immigrant history, like the Jewish farming communities in Southern New Jersey and political activism within West Indian communities. In closing, I would like to thank all of today's presenters, especially our compelling keynote speaker, Dr. Mae Ngai. We appreciate having you here today, and your distinguished work is contributing to a greater understanding of our shared history. I want to also thank the Historical Commission's Director, Sara Cureton, and her team for their work in making today's conference and all of their work supporting and enhancing New Jersey's history. I encourage you to keep up with the Historical Commission's work as the team continues to expand on the powerful stories of New Jersey's immigrants. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy today's conference.
Thank you, Secretary Way. We appreciate your leadership always. My name is Noelle Lorraine Williams, and I'm the director of the African American History Program here at the New Jersey Historical Commission and the staff organizer for today's conference. And I am pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Mae Ngai. Dr. Ngai is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History and co-director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. She is a U.S. legal and political historian interested in the histories of immigration, citizenship, nationalism, and the Chinese diaspora. She is the author of the award-winning Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, and The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes in Global Politics. Dr. Ngai has written on immigration history and the policy for the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and Dissent. Before becoming a historian, she was a labor union organizer and educator in New York City, working for District 65 UAW and the Consortium for Worker Education. She is now writing Nation of Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea, under contract with Princeton University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mae Ngai.
Good morning. Thanks so much to the New Jersey Historical Commission, to Director Sara Cureton, Noelle Williams, and Beth Lawrence, and special thanks to Secretary of State Way, taking time out of your busy day when we're on the eve of an election. It's my great pleasure and honor to speak to you this morning. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Here. The title of my presentation today, Shocking but Not Surprising, refers to the current wave of racist attacks against Asian Americans, sparked by those who blame China and Chinese for the coronavirus pandemic, especially the former president, but ongoing and even increasing nearly 3 years later. These attacks, often violent and deadly, and often against women and elders, have shocked Americans of good conscience. They've also shocked Asian Americans who are familiar with stereotyping and discrimination, but perhaps not racist violence. I had my own experience in New York in March 2021, when a man passing me on Broadway gave me a hard shove as he walked by. He said nothing, but it was deliberate, and I knew it was racially motivated. I have a friend, the daughter of Chinese immigrants, whose mother now wonders, were we wrong to come here? I know many Asian Americans, men as well as women, who have stopped riding the subway. It's just too dangerous, they say. And I myself take the subway less and less. But
Dr. Ngai?
Yes?
Hi, thank you. For some reason, the screen is not showing.
Oh.
I just want to make sure that it loads fully.
I'm sorry about that. Let me try again.
Oh, it's fine. Sorry to interrupt you and everyone.
Well, I want people to see the screen, so thank you for alerting me. Okay, now you can see it, right?
Yes.
And is that okay?
Yeah, we'll
Are
just,
you getting the full screen now?
yes, we are. Thank you.
So we're good. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. We're, after 3 years, we're still struggling with Zoom. But as shocking as this wave of violence has been, I want to add it's not surprising, because the current racial hatred and violence has deep historical roots. So in my talk today, I will review the historical origins of anti-Chinese racism in the United States, drawing in part from my new book, The Chinese Question, which was published last year, as well as its reproduction over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I want to draw from this history a way that we might think about the political choices that Americans made in the past and the choices that we face today. Now, in the late 19th century, white Americans faced the prospect that Chinese and other Asians might become a significant portion of the population of the United States. In response, they passed a series of laws excluding Chinese people from immigration and citizenship. The justification for exclusion was that the Chinese were an unassimilable race and therefore could never become Americans. Exclusion soon extended to all Asians and remained in US law until 1952. Its rationale that Asians pose a danger to American society has endured in our politics and culture to this day. So I want to pause for a moment with a thought experiment to think about how these ideas endure. Imagine that there had been no exclusion laws and that Chinese and other Asians had continued to freely immigrate to the United States, just like Europeans. California, the West, indeed the whole country would look radically different today. Not all of Asia's so-called teeming masses would have inundated the United States. Migration doesn't work that way. The poorest don't migrate because they can't afford it, and the wealthiest don't need to. Migration sets patterns or chains from certain areas and not others. Still, by 1950, many millions of Asian Americans would have been building their lives in the US and in the process contributing to this country. Instead, in that year, 1950, there were a mere 320,000 Asian Americans, composing just 0.2% of the US population. Since the immigration reforms of 1965, the number of Asian Americans has increased, but we are still barely 6% of the total US population, barely 6%. Yet too many Americans still believe there are too many Asians in this country and that we don't belong here. The racist attacks against Asian Americans during the pandemic, including the killing of Asian massage workers in Atlanta last year, and the deadly assaults against Chinese women in New York City, are shocking, but they are not surprising. They have deep historical roots. Chinese people first came to the US in large numbers during the California Gold Rush of 1848 and 49, which crowned the continental expansion of the United States. Under the sign of manifest destiny, the idea that the West was God's gift to white Protestant Americans, the United States had gone to war with Mexico and annexed its northern half, including California. Westward expansion absorbed the sectional conflict over slavery and brought the genocide of indigenous peoples across the Great Plains and the West. When Euro-American settlers arrived at the edge of the continent, they celebrated their conquest of the West and their closing of the frontier. And from there, they looked out across the Pacific Ocean, the next frontier, with both excitement at the prospect of new conquests, as well as anxiety over the new peoples that might come. This idea of manifest destiny might seem quaint to our ears today, but its core imperative of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation continued to define the dominant vision of the United States for at least a century and is enjoying a revival in our own time. Now, the gold rush is often celebrated for the individual daring, ingenuity, and male comradeship of the 49ers, engaged in a bold experiment in democratic self-government. Less well remembered, but no less true, is that it was also violent and racist. Gold seekers and the fledgling state government of California pursued the extermination of Indian people. White native-born Americans agitated against all foreign miners, weaponizing manifest destiny for competitive gain and driving many European, Australian, Chilean, Sonoran, and Chinese miners from the diggings. Hostility against the Chinese took a special cast in 1852. California's first governor, John Bigler, was facing a tight race for re-election. He made an incendiary speech before the state legislature, claiming that Chinese were a race of heathens and slaves, and that they were invading the state and threatening its society of free producers. Leaflets printed by Bigler and newspaper accounts circulated copies of his speech around the state. Many miners were already anxious because the easy gold in the rivers was being depleted and deep-pocketed capitalists were taking over the industry, replacing independent prospecting with wage labor in underground quartz mines. Bigler's bigotry found a receptive audience. White miners passed resolutions to keep Chinese people out of their districts and provided the votes Bigler needed to win a second term. He operated from the classic nativist playbook: tap into a popular grievance, offer a theory that blames an outside group, and weaponize resentment for partisan gain. Now, Chinese people in California were voluntary immigrants and independent prospectors, not indentured workers. Bigler spread a big lie with the claim that coolies are being sent here under contract. He claimed these were not bona fide contracts, but contracts that were rooted in moral turpitude and coercion. In doing so, he invoked two contemporary anxieties. One was the use, mainly by the British, of Indian indentured labor in the Caribbean plantation colonies after the abolition of slavery. The other was the more proximate example of slavery in the American South. These two associations, colonialism and slavery, inspired the racist theories against Chinese immigrants and have haunted Chinese Americans ever since. Two Chinese American merchant leaders in San Francisco, Tom Achik and Hopwa, wrote a letter to Bigler refuting his claims. They explained that the Chinese in California included laborers, tradespeople, mechanics, gentry, and teachers. Quote, none are coolies if by that word you mean bound men or contract slaves. In the important matters, they went on, we are good men, we honor our parents, we take care of our children, we pay our debts and are peaceable, we trade much, we are trusted for large and small sums, we pay our debts and are honest, and of course, we tell the truth. Finally, Tong and Hobb asserted that there was a positive relationship between migration and trade, that they were mutually supporting elements of foreign contact and exchange. They said, quote, if you want to check immigration from Asia, You will have to do it by checking Asiatic commerce. Now, a resurgence of racism against the Chinese engulfed San Francisco in the 1870s, including mob violence, arson, and discriminatory municipal ordinances. This hatred emerged after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which brought unforeseen consequences to the West. California's new connection to the East Coast encouraged domestic migration and the importation of cheap manufactured goods, resulting in falling wages and unemployment. Integration into the national market brought the long tail of economic recession to the East. But the coolie trope was remarkably adaptive to new conditions. The philosopher Henry George gave it theoretical heft, using what was then referred to as the Chinese question to test his emerging views about labor and monopoly. George argued that unlike European immigrants whose wages eventually rose to the level of native-born workers, Chinese immigrants were a permanent source of cheap labor because they were unassimilable coolies. George imagined a class struggle between workers and capitalists, but he put the Chinese in the camp of the bosses. Anti-coolieism also targeted Chinese women. Now, there weren't many Chinese immigrant women in California, but some were wives of merchants and workers, or the wives of fishermen who worked alongside their husbands as partners, and others were servants of wealthy Chinese. They also included sex workers who offered services to both Chinese and white men. But the anti-Chinese movement stereotyped all Chinese women as prostitutes, dubbing them as slave girls, the female counterparts to the coolie laborers. These attacks portrayed them as diseased and immoral, but that rhetoric was also laced with exoticism and desire. San Francisco's most famous Madame Atoy was said to be so beautiful that men paid an ounce of gold just to look at her. Congress passed 2 laws to restrict Chinese immigration. The Page Act of 1875 excluded so-called Mongolian prostitutes, which required all women to be interrogated to prove that they were not a prostitute, that is, to prove a negative. Unsurprisingly, Chinese female immigration plummeted. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred all Chinese laborers from entering the United States and all Chinese immigrants from naturalized citizenship. These laws codified the ideas that the Chinese were racially unassimilable. They could never be anything but a coolie race, controlled by despotic masters without individual personality or will, in no way independent in thought or action. The US Supreme Court layered another theory onto coolieism, that Chinese exclusion was necessary for national security. Previously, federal regulation of immigration had been justified under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. In upholding Chinese exclusion, the court invoked national security to justify racist legislation. The Chinese exclusion laws were subsequently extended to the people of the Philippines, India, and Japan. Indeed, an entire barred Asiatic zone was established in 1917, lumping different national origin groups into a single racial category called the Asiatic. Modern colonialism and global trade meant a greater integration of the global economy, and with it mass migration, sparking struggles over race and immigration throughout the Anglophone world. As the Chinese merchants had pointed out in 1852, trade begets migration and vice versa. American policymakers constructed an open door to China that would swing only one way. For all this talk about the equality of nations and the open door, the American approach was typically colonial, treating China as an object of commercial and missionary desire, the Chinese people as degraded and backward, undesirable as immigrants. Now, the settler colonies of the British Empire followed the example of the United States. Canada mimicked America's Chinese exclusion laws, and Australia adopted an unapologetic white Australia policy in 1901. South Africa took inspiration from Jim Crow in the US and from white Australia. In the early 20th century, American and British racists for publishing paranoid screeds like The Passing of the Great Race, The Asiatic Danger in the Colonies, and The Rising Tide of Color, to promote the idea that the temperate zones of the world should be reserved for the white race. These were early iterations of what white supremacists today embrace as replacement theory. But not only white supremacists connected domestic and foreign policies, anti-racist and anti-imperialists also found common cause and solidarity across the global color lines. In China, the anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a bestseller in 1901, when it became the first American novel to be translated into Chinese. A book reviewer in Shanghai wrote, "This book is not really about the sufferings of the Black race, as it is about all races under the whites. The novel is a wake-up call to rouse us from a deep dream." For many Asian Americans, the policy of exclusion looms as large as Jim Crow does for Black people. The association is more than a metaphor. In the late 19th century, Jim Crow and Chinese exclusion were related projects of white supremacy, one in the South and one in the West. After the Civil War, the old planter class and the new industrialists in the South responded to the prospect of equality for the formerly enslaved people by relegating them to second-class status, stripped of the franchise and other civil rights. The dangers that white supremacists associated with Black citizenship provided an object lesson for why Chinese people should be excluded. A reactionary political alliance of the West and the South pushed the Chinese exclusion laws through Congress. Asiatic exclusion and Jim Crow segregation were two modes of racial management necessary for white supremacy after the Civil War, when the West and the South were being integrated into a national economy based on corporate capital and a polity made up of white male voters. These policies relied on euphemisms and legal fictions, aliens ineligible for citizenship, and separate but equal, to work around the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection and due process for all. Indeed, in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court would interpret the 14th Amendment to favor the rights of capital, not those of the formerly enslaved people or Asian immigrants. Laws like these were not preordained, but resulted from a choice made between two competing visions. The nation could be built on the principle of white supremacy or on the principle of democracy. Frederick Douglass understood that the futures of the South and the West were entwined, and that together they would determine the fate of the nation as a whole. Douglass spoke out against Chinese exclusion in 1869. He recognized it as a backward move that threatened the freedom of the former slaves and indeed of all Americans. In a famous speech called The Composite Nation, Douglass recognized that migration is a human right. He said we should welcome the Chinese, and he was unbothered by the prospect that Chinese immigrants might come in large numbers. Let them come, he said, and let us welcome them, for they will become part of our nation. I want a home here, not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, he said, but I want the Asiatic to also find a home here in the United States and feel at home here for both his sake and ours. Douglass also made a prescient connection between domestic immigration policy and imperialistic foreign policy. He said, quote, "If the white race may exclude all other races from this continent, it may rightfully do the same in respect to all other lands, islands, capes, and continents, and thus have all the world to itself. Thus, what would seem to belong to the whole would become the property only of a part." Now, racisms, while originating in specific contexts, must be continually reproduced in order to remain potent. Because the exclusion laws could not eliminate all Asians from the United States, although that was their intention, the Western states erected a legal edifice to ensure the subordination and marginalization of Asians. Racist laws forbade Asians from marrying white people, from attending white schools, testifying in court against whites, owning agricultural property, and holding commercial and professional licenses. Restrictive covenants barred the sale of real estate to Negroes, Jews, and Orientals. Exclusion underwrote the popular understanding that Asian Americans born in the United States were not true citizens despite their birthright. The presumption of foreign loyalties most famously led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II on the grounds that they were a so-called enemy race. Most racist laws against Asians remained in force until the late 1940s, when Black civil rights activism defeated similar restrictions on African Americans. The Asian exclusion laws themselves fell between 1943 and 1952, the result of wartime foreign policy imperatives. When Congress repealed the laws, however, it imposed minuscule annual quotas on the Asian countries. Nevertheless, immigration opened up a bit, and Asian Americans made small steps in socioeconomic and residential mobility, gaining access to the professions and the suburbs. During the Cold War, an ideological space emerged in which Asian Americans could declare opposition to communism in East Asia as a way to assert their loyalty to the United States. They also cannily produced stereotyped cultural qualities that Asian Americans are quiet, good workers, good students, and respectful of their parents, to advocate for their social inclusions. Journalists and sociologists weaponize these ideas to discipline Black and Latino people, and some Asian Americans believe that they were better too. Through these complex dynamics, as historian Ellen Wu has said, Asian Americans' place on the racial landscape went from being definitively not white to definitively not Black. But the repeal of the exclusion laws, incremental socioeconomic mobility, and even the establishment of equal immigration quotas in 1965 were insufficient to eradicate racism against Asian Americans. That is in part because of the weight of history, but it is also because racism found ample grounds for reproduction in the conduct of American colonialism and wars in the Asia-Pacific region. Although all wars entail the dehumanization of the enemy, the dehumanization of Asians is distinctive in its racial idiom and its persistence across time. It centers around the ideas that for Asians, life is cheap, and that as uncivilized people, they do not engage in civilized warfare, and therefore must be fought with like means. During the Philippine-American War, from 1899 to 1902, the United States invented waterboarding to torture Filipino guerrilla fighters. The US Army also burned villages and rounded up civilians in strategic hamlets, a practice it would later use in Vietnam. And the United States dropped atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and napalm and Agent Orange on Vietnam. In truth, it was the US military that considered Asian life cheap and engaged in barbaric warfare. The prostitution of Asian women for American servicemen is an enduring feature of the US military experience in Asia. Sex markets have ringed US Army and Navy bases, whether during wartime or Cold War occupation, in Vietnam, Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guam. This long history of military prostitution has generated racist and misogynist stereotypes in which Asian women were portrayed as exotic, subservient, and always available. And finally, to the hot and cold wars, we must add the trade wars. In the 1980s, the introduction of Japanese electronics and automobiles into the US market sparked a racially tinged protectionist movement. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the killing of Vincent Chin, a young Chinese American in Detroit. At a bachelor's party on the eve of his wedding, Chin was attacked by two white auto workers who blamed him for taking their jobs. This misrecognition of a Chinese for Japanese being typical in American racism. They beat him to death with a baseball bat. And then at trial, where they pleaded a deal for manslaughter, they were given a suspended sentence and a $3,000 fine. In the early 21st century, Americans' anxiety about China's rise as a global economic power has fueled a new round of yellow peril racism. The figure of the coolie hasn't returned, embodied in factory assembly workers in China, in China's special economic zones, and in the Chinese international and Chinese American university students in the United States. They are both imagined to toil under slave-like conditions ruled by the Communist Party or by their tiger moms. Their extreme labor posing unfair competition against white American workers and students. The stereotype of the high-achieving model minority, aside from obscuring major differences in socioeconomic status among different Asian groups, is a pathology, not a compliment. Let me just conclude by with a few comments about the writings from the late sociologist Stuart Hall, who wrote that we ought to understand not racism in general, but racisms. According to Stuart Hall, racism might be everywhere a deeply anti-human and antisocial practice, but it is not everywhere the same. Specific histories, contexts, and environments produce particular racisms, he said. And Hall understood too that there's no such thing as race in a biological sense. Rather, racism is a way of thinking about social groups according to differences that are presumed to be natural and immutable. Racism is more than a series of stereotypes. It is ideological, a way of looking at the world that justifies and explains material structures of inequality that informs the life chances of racialized groups. In the United States, myriad racisms uphold the logics and practices of white supremacy. Americans are still struggling over competing ideas of what the nation should be. Sadly, that debate still includes whether Asians belong or whether racism against them even exists. Although the white supremacist vision of manifest destiny today animates a sector of American society, we still have another choice. Frederick Douglass's vision offers us a path towards a more inclusive future, should we decide to stand in solidarity against all racisms. The choice between inclusion and exclusion is a part of the struggle for democracy, which is, in my view, at the heart of all politics today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Ngai, for that really thought-provoking talk. And we're delighted to share with you now some of the questions that have been coming in from our participants today. And here's the first one. Gail asks, what have you been able to document as the earliest Asian to be reflected in the American colonies? Who were they and where were they located? So a question about the earliest Asian arrivals here in what we now know as the United States.
Thanks, that's a great question. I think the very first Asians were Filipinos who, sorry, falling apart here. There are Filipinos who worked on the Spanish galleon ships that every year traveled between Manila and Acapulco, carrying silver in the direction of Asia, which was exchanged for luxury goods that was brought to Mexico and then to Europe. Interestingly, the Philippines itself was a kind of transfer point for both silver and products from China. But there were Filipinos who worked on these ships, and some of them got off in Mexico. And I think the first ones that we have any documentation about were New Orleans. So this would be in the 18th century.
Thank you so much. And I do want to tell everyone there was a question as well. We will be providing a recording of today's program to you as registrants. So yes, you will get a recording of this. And I know that we've had a couple folks mention that their audio, they're having a little bit of trouble with their audio. We apologize for that. Do let us know in the chat, in the Q&A rather, if you continue to have issues. And again, we will be distributing the recording, so you will have that coming up. We have another question, Dr. Ngai. The 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States is approaching in 2026. One of the big goals in the Revolution NJ Initiative, which is New Jersey's commemoration, is to engage a diverse public and build historical thinking. Do you have any advice on how historic sites and organizations around the state can engage with Asian American communities in their programming and outreach efforts? I worry that sometimes historic sites stick to a very narrow narrative, i.e. we only tell the story of the American Revolution or some famous individual and do not engage with contemporary communities or concerns. That's a big question.
That's a big question. And I don't know if I can give you a big answer. But I think if you look, there are places in New Jersey that historically have had Asian American populations. The one that comes to my mind is Seabrook.
Mm-hmm.
Seabrook was one of the largest commercial farms in the country, actually. And during World War II, the owner of Seabrook Farms arranged for Japanese Americans who were in the internment camps to move to New Jersey and to work on his farm. And I think there were over 1,000, maybe even 2,000 Japanese Americans who went to work in Seabrook towards the end of the war and after the war. After the war, some of them returned to California where they were from, but there was a small community there that persisted for quite some time. And even today, every year they have an Oban festival in Seabrook that's sponsored by the Buddhist church. So there's a site you could select. It has, I think, really interesting historical significance because probably most people in New Jersey or even elsewhere don't know that there are Japanese Americans who were recruited out of the internment camps to work on a New Jersey farm.
That's a great example. Absolutely. I wanted to follow that up with another geographical question for you. I think many of us know a little bit, at least, about what was happening in California and in New York City. But I think there's less known about the experience of Asian Americans in other parts of the country, including New Jersey. You've given us one great example. Could you share with us a little bit of a geographical perspective about how the experiences may have been similar or varied across the nation?
That's a great question. But before I forget, I want to give you another site, is Newark.
Newark, of course.
Newark had a Chinese community in the early 20th century. I think it was kind of a spillover from New York City, Chinatown. But there were Chinese laundries in Newark. I think even in the 19th century, I've read about a case where there was a laundry, a big commercial laundry in Newark that recruited Chinese as strikebreakers when there was a strike by their regular employees. But going back to your, well, then that's actually a segue into a partial answer, Sarah, to your question. Some of the earliest Chinese on the East Coast were recruited as strikebreakers to Massachusetts, where there was a strike in a shoe factory. And several hundred Chinese were brought over from California to work in I think it was called West Adams, Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts. And there were Chinese who were recruited by missionaries to study at Yale College. They were recruited to go to Hartford for high school, and then they went on to Yale. That was in the 1850s. But most of the Chinese on the East Coast were people who came east by one of two ways. One is they worked on the railroad. You know, the Chinese comprised upwards of 90% of the labor that built the western section of the railroad. And after the railroad was completed in 1869, some of them worked on, you know, smaller trunk lines. And so everywhere the railroad went, you could find a Chinese community where people just said, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to stay here.
Right.
So that's one way that Chinese moved from west to east. The other way was that once the exclusion laws were passed, and it became very difficult to enter the country through San Francisco, which had been the main port of entry, Chinese started to go to Canada, where they could legally enter for a while. I mean, after a while, they actually had an exclusion law too, but for a while they could go to Canada and pay a head tax. And the Canadians thought that a head tax would be a deterrence for Chinese. But the Chinese went, they paid the head tax, and then they took the Canadian railroad all the way across the country, and they would walk into the United States from into New York State or Vermont or Maine. And often they would turn themselves in to an immigration station. And then they would go before a judge, and then somebody from Boston Chinatown would show up and vouch for that person and say, oh yeah, I know him, he was, he's born to citizens, he's a citizen, and then they would get discharged with a paper that said they were a citizen. And that is the origin of the so-called paper sons, people who came and said that they were the sons or daughters, but mostly sons of Chinese who were born in the United States, and then went back to China, and now here comes back the child at the age of 18. So then the Chinese would then proceed from, sometimes they went through Windsor to Detroit, but mostly they came through New York, and then they settled in Chinatowns in Boston and in New York City and along the East Coast.
Oh, thank you. That really shares a lot of insight. And I do want to just make sure everyone is tracking our chat, because we've had some additional terrific resources shared there. One from Dr. Andy Urban related to some additional information on Seabrook Farms. So please take a look at that, and also some additional notes from Tom Anker up at the Newark Public Library. So thank you for adding that in. And then finally, another of our attendees has noted that they hosted a talk and discussion about the volume when Newark had a Chinatown, and offered a YouTube link. So please do check those out, everyone. But we have another question from Barbara, who asks, in early America, African Americans were not allowed to bury their dead in white cemeteries. Were Asian Americans discriminated against in this way also?
That was the case in the West Coast. The Chinese had either, I think they had a section of the general cemetery. So they were in the so-called white cemetery, but they were segregated off. And the Chinese also had a custom by which, after, if you were a sojourner working in the United States and you had the misfortune to die in America, you would be buried. But then after, several years, they would dig up the bones and send the bones back to China. And this is very important in the Chinese culture, that one's spirit could not rest until the bones were taken back to the ancestral village. I don't know what the situation is on the East Coast. The East Coast, like New York, which had a large population of Chinese, and therefore we can assume there were Chinese who passed away in New York City. New York did not have, the eastern states in general did not have the same kind of discriminatory laws that California and the Western states did. All the Western states had, the laws that I mentioned, about not being able to marry a white person or testify in court or by property. Those were principally in the Pacific Coast states.
Oh, thank you so much. I do want to add that Tara Maharjan has shared that Merak NJ with Library Link NJ is working to collect a list of AAPI resources and collections to help K-12 educators. So please note that. And Tara's noting that they're looking for contributions. And that actually leads me to a question I wanted to pose to you as well. As you heard, we in New Jersey have just had a wonderful new direction to our K-12 educators to include Asian American history. I wonder if you have any advice, because one of the great challenges to our teachers is often they are met with wonderful new challenges, but then don't always have easy access to resources to be able to actually use in the classroom. Do you have any suggestions, any advice for our New Jersey educators about where to look and some resources that really could work well for students?
I have a fantastic recommendation for you.
Excellent.
There's a wonderful nonprofit called Immigrant History Institute, IHI. I believe one of their directors is on your program later today. They have put together a lot of curriculum resources, and they are working in New Jersey. They have taken on New Jersey as their special project to work with school districts and teachers to help them bring Asian American curriculum into the classroom. So there is an organization that is dedicated to this challenge, and I think it is a challenge because, you know, I think the only negative thing I can say about the New Jersey law is that it's not funded. It's not a funded mandate. So school districts have to figure out how they're going to do it, you know, how professional development is going to be undertaken. I think that, you know, if there can be some follow-up with the state, you know, to provide some resources to actually make this happen better. It would be a big improvement. But IHI is a wonderful organization, and I've worked with them on some other curriculum projects, and they are available to you in the state of New Jersey.
That's terrific. And I note that already in the chat, we've got a link to that resource in there for our attendees to check out. One of the things actually that we're doing in preparation for the semi-quincentennial is preparing a section of a new website with resources for educators. So we will work to link some of those resources you've just noted as well. Because I agree, we hear that from teachers frequently, is that you know, they get wonderful new directives, but they don't often have those resources that are so essential, and the professional development opportunities to actually do the critical teaching that needs to take place. We have some more comments coming in here. Fernanda Perron is noting that 8 Japanese nationals who died in the Northeast in 1870 to 1887, this is picking up on the question about burials, are buried in a special section of a former commercial cemetery in New Brunswick, which is a Buddhist sectionary of the cemetery. It was purchased by the Japanese government. So thank you, Fernanda. And we have another recommendation of a website. The website has many lesson plans ready to be adopted by K-12 classes, the Asian American Education Project, and a link there as well. Dr. Green, Larry Green is here with us. Nice to hear from him. And he does have a question for you, Dr. Ngai. He asks, what present efforts exist to combat anti-Asian hate among other disaffected groups who have been victims of racism to make a common front against racism? Another nothing but big questions for you today.
I think there should be coalitions and solidarity among groups. I'm not sure how organized that is. You know, I know during the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd, many Asian Americans, myself included, you know, went to the streets in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And in my university at Columbia, when we have programs about the current violence against Asian Americans, we see students from all backgrounds who are concerned about that. So I think there is concern across groups. But I think we have a lot of challenges, we have to do a lot more education to show that even though we may have different experiences, we might experience racism in different ways. There's also tension and conflict between groups, and we have to talk more with each other to overcome them. For example, the thing that is, kind of screaming at us right now is the Supreme Court's hearing of the Harvard affirmative action case.
Right.
And that case is, it's really, well, the lawyer, the people behind the case are not actually Asian Americans. They're white conservatives. And it's the organization and the lawyers who brought the losing cases against affirmative action in Michigan and Texas. And so they very cleverly decided to use Asians as a wedge group, right, to say that Asians are suffering from affirmative action because Asians with perfect scores are passed over at Harvard in favor of Blacks and Latinos who have lower scores. Now, so there's two pieces of research I want to just cite to you. There's a lot of writing that's been done about this. First, at Harvard, where the case is based, the rate of rejection of Asian American applicants with perfect scores is about the same or even a little less than the rate of rejection of white applicants with perfect scores. So the question is more, I think, should your scores or your grades be the only determinant for admission to an elite university? And Harvard has decided, and I think correctly, that scores and grades are not the whole story, and they look at the whole person. So whether or not a student has a talent in a musical instrument or in a sport, or even if their parents went to Harvard, the so-called legacy, that's an affirmative action program right there. Sure. So Harvard says it takes race into account. It's not the only determinant, but it's part of a whole picture of what they want to consider in their application. So it's not true that Asians are punished for having high scores. Harvard has such a selective admissions process that tons of students apply there with perfect scores or very high scores and they don't get in. That's number one. The other thing I want to point out is that research done by Asian Americans has shown, interestingly, that I think in 2014 or 16, I don't recall which year, but over 70% of all Asian Americans supported affirmative action. Mm-hmm. And when the poll was retaken in 2018, which is the time of the affirmative action lawsuit against Harvard, it was over 2/3, close to 70% for Asian Americans, but the only group who started to oppose it were Chinese Americans. And Chinese American support for affirmative action dropped to about 40%. So everybody else is at 70%. And the Chinese dropped to 40%. So why is that? Well, I think this is driven by wealthy Chinese immigrants whose idea of success is very narrow. Their idea of success is your kid goes to Harvard. Maybe Princeton would be okay, but Harvard is the gold ring, right? And so they, it's not about going to college, it's about going to Harvard, right? It's about going to an elite school. So it's a certain demographic among Asian Americans that has been willing to be used in this racist takedown of affirmative action. But I think it behooves us to understand that not all Asian Americans think the same or have the same experience. Some Asian American groups, especially those who descend from the refugees from the Indo-Chinese wars, Hmong, Cambodians, Vietnamese. They are some of the poorest Americans of any group in the country, and suffer great educational discriminations. But not just, even Indians, South Asians, who typically come from, have a certain large proportion of professionals in their demographics. They still support affirmative action. So I think this is, the publicity that has been gained by this lawsuit from the conservatives has been very damaging to unities and solidarities across racial lines, is damaging to it perpetuates certain stereotypes about Asian Americans, which are false or very incomplete. So I think that's an example. So I'm not really answering your question, how do we get together? But part of it is we have to talk more.
Sure.
Right, and reach out across racial lines. And I was actually very heartened when I saw the photographs in the New York Times at the Supreme Court, where there are large crowds of people. Whenever there's a controversial case that's being heard by the court, everybody shows up. And there were a lot of Asian Americans there with signs that said, we don't want to be a wedge. Right, meaning they don't want to be used.
Right, exactly, sure.
As a wedge against other minority groups.
Thank you. No, you did an excellent job of answering that big question. And as we head toward the end of our time together, we wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on your own experience, if you would, as a labor organizer. And how that experience over time and in the present time, how that has informed the work you do as a scholar. How do those two parts of what the work you do inform each other?
Well, I think that being a community organizer in Chinatown and then working for labor unions. I myself come from a middle class background. I'm actually from Teaneck, New Jersey, so fellow Jerseyan. But I was brought up in a middle class household. But being an activist in Chinatown and working with labor unions, I got to know so many people from different backgrounds than my own, and I was exposed to, their concerns, their struggles, their issues. And so I think, when I decided to kind of go back to school at an older age and to study, I wanted to get my degree with a specialization in labor and immigration history. I think I already had developed over the years a kind of, understanding from the real world about what working people and immigrants go through. So in general, I actually recommend to students who are thinking about going to graduate school that you should not go to graduate school just out of college. You should get some experience in the real world, work, travel, work at anything, just, something that's beyond the classroom. And it'll actually make you a better student if you want to go for advanced studies. And these days, it's very difficult to pursue a PhD and to get an academic job. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows the academic job market is terrible. Although the few areas where there are jobs is in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, Latino studies, Native American studies, African American studies. I think that this reflects in part the realization in higher education that they need to have more faculty teaching ethnic studies because the students are demanding it, right? Sure. The students want it. So if you want to get an advanced degree in Asian American studies or Latino studies or Black studies, there are jobs and we need people in the pipeline, as we call it, who could be the teachers, for the next generation.
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And one of our big concerns over at the Historical Commission and certainly in the public history field is finding those pathways for emerging professionals so that they can thrive and prosper in this discipline. So thank you for your advice on that as well. And I do want to thank you so much, Dr. Ngai, for sharing your presentation with us this morning and for all the great conversation. For everyone who's joining us today, we've had a wonderful turnout this morning. There are some additional suggestions that our attendees have offered for other materials for you to look into. Please check those out. And again, we will have a recording of today's program available to you all as registrants for you to enjoy and share and continue to learn from. So with that, again, thank you, Dr. Ngai. This has been a fantastic conversation. And everyone else, I think we have a brief break and then we will reconvene for a very rich selection of panel presentations for the rest of the day. So please enjoy the rest of the conference and we will see you after a very short break. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thank you.